The world's largest oil reserves, sitting in a country where 30% of the population has already fled, Russian and Iranian weapons flowing in. And in August 2025, for the first time since the 1980s, the United States assembled a massive naval strike force just miles from Venezuela's coast. 8 warships, a nuclear submarine, over 4,000 Marines. Officially, it's about drugs and refugees. But here's the truth. Nobody wants to say out loud. Washington may actually be preparing to invade. Why now? Today, we're unpacking the hidden evidence. From collapsing oil pipelines, to China's secret deals, to the quiet military buildup that proves why the U.S. might be closer than ever to war in its own backyard. This isn't happening in some distant corner of the world. This is the Caribbean, America's backyard. And it involves the second largest refugee crisis on Earth after Syria. 7.9 million Venezuelans have fled. That's bigger than Switzerland's entire population. A country with more oil than Saudi Arabia can't even keep its own lights on. And now, the United States has assembled enough firepower offshore to topple the government in days. To understand why this is happening now, we need to rewind to where it started. It all began in 1999 when Hugo Chavez stormed into power, building his entire political brand around defying Washington. By 2002, the relationship had already collapsed. This wasn't conspiracy theory. This was documented reality that would haunt the next 20 years. The CIA actually backed a coup that briefly removed Chavez from office. This wasn't conspiracy theory. This was documented reality that would haunt the next 20 years. The coup failed, but it validated every fear Chavez had been preaching, so he doubled down. He seized oil fields from American companies, formed alliances with Cuba, Iran, and Russia, and turned anti-Americanism into Venezuela's official brand. The U.S. hit back with sanctions. Every action triggered retaliation, a spiral that couldn't be stopped. When Chavez died in 2013, Nicolas Maduro made things exponentially worse. In 2019, the U.S. declared opposition leader Juan Guaidó the real president and openly backed a coup attempt. Think about that. Washington officially recognized someone who didn't control a single government building as the legitimate president of a foreign country. The plan failed, but the message was clear. Behind every crisis, every sanction, were always the same 3 motives. Oil, the largest reserves on Earth. Power, removing a hostile government. And containment, blocking Russia, China, and Iran from gaining a foothold in America's backyard. By 2025, Maduro forced his way into a 3rd term after a blatantly rigged election. Venezuela was completely isolated. No diplomatic ties, no trust, no safety valve. The entire relationship had become a high-stakes chess match where one wrong move could trigger open conflict. But here's where the story gets truly bizarre. The country with the world's largest oil reserves can't even pump its own oil. The oil paradox. Venezuela sits on 304 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. In the 1990s, it pumped over 3 million barrels a day. Today, less than 20% of peak production. How is this possible? Venezuela's oil is so thick and heavy that it literally can't flow through pipelines without being mixed with lighter fuels. So the country with more oil than anyone has to import fuel from Iran just to move its own crude. Think about that absurdity. The infrastructure is falling apart. Over 25 pipelines, many more than 50 years old, are leaking and breaking. Oil spills are routine. Refineries run at less than 10% capacity. Fixing it would take $58 billion just to reach 1990s levels. Where would that money come from? And when Venezuela tried to pivot to natural gas, the Dragon Field project, a $35 billion development, Washington pulled Shell and BP's licenses in 2025. The project died overnight. This was a clear message. The U.S. was choking Venezuela's energy lifeline completely. But the real death spiral is the brain drain. In the late 1990s, state oil company PDVSA employed over 40,000 trained engineers. Today, fewer than 12,000 remain. The experts fled to Canada, Colombia, and Texas, taking decades of irreplaceable knowledge with them. What's left? Soviet-era machines breaking down weekly. Workers patching leaks with improvised fixes. Venezuela has become an oil superpower that literally can't extract, refine, or export its own resources. This oil collapse triggered an economic freefall almost unheard of outside wartime. The economy shrank by 75% between 2013 and 2025, one of the worst peacetime collapses in history. Inflation peaked at over 1,000,000% annually. 7 out of 10 Venezuelans now live in poverty. And nearly 1 in 3 have fled the country. 7.9 million refugees, second only to Syria globally. But while Venezuela burned from within, some countries saw opportunity. Foreign powers move in. As Maduro's economy imploded, Russia, China, and Iran all stepped in to turn Venezuela into a strategic outpost in America's backyard. May 2025, Maduro stood in Moscow and signed a sweeping 10-year strategic partnership with Russia covering energy, finance, and most alarmingly, military cooperation. Venezuela's foreign minister bragged it was the first time in history a Latin American nation had signed a deal of this scale with Russia. What did Russia provide? Spare parts for Soviet-era fighter jets, air defense upgrades. Intelligence reports now say 100 to 200 Russian military advisors are embedded on the ground, with joint weapons factories under discussion. China reopened crucial oil credit lines and poured money into infrastructure designed to lock up Venezuelan resources for decades. At the UN, Beijing has shielded Maduro repeatedly, vetoing condemnation resolutions while securing long-term oil deals. But the most combustible partner is Iran. Since 2021, Tehran has supplied refinery technology worth nearly $500 million and helped overhaul Venezuela's largest refineries. Now, intelligence reports say Iranian drones, anti-ship missiles, and small naval vessels have made their way into Venezuela's arsenal, weapons specifically designed to threaten U.S. naval operations. Add thousands of Cuban security advisors, Colombian guerrilla groups, and narco cartels operating freely across borders, and you get this. Venezuela is no longer just a failing state. Pentagon officials describe it exactly this way: a forward operating base for hostile powers in America's backyard. And that's when Trump decided enough was enough. The Trump escalation and naval buildup. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he immediately scrapped oil waivers and revoked Chevron's license. Venezuela lost an estimated $200 million per month, but the real shock came July 25, 2025. For the first time in American history, the U.S. Treasury labeled an entire foreign military as a global terrorist organization. The Venezuelan High Command, every asset frozen, every transaction criminalized. No military had ever been hit with that label before. Trump doubled the bounty on Maduro to $50 million and quietly ordered the Pentagon to prepare military options. By late August, those options became very real. A U.S. naval strike group moved into the Southern Caribbean, the largest American show of force in the region since the 1980s. Here's what was deployed. 3 Aegis destroyers capable of wiping out Venezuela's air defenses in hours. 1 guided missile cruiser, the USS Lake Erie, specifically transited the Panama Canal to join the force. And the centerpiece, the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima, carrying 4,500 troops including 2,200 Marines, with helicopters and amphibious vehicles. A floating invasion force. Behind them lurked the nuclear submarine USS Newport News, a silent deterrent to Russian or Chinese interference. On paper, this was about drugs and refugees, but the buildup sent a different message. This looked less like policing cartels and more like preparing for war. Venezuela was watching. Satellite images showed frantic preparations, new defense corridors around oil facilities, reinforced coastal radar, dozens of gunboats deployed. Maduro personally toured border states, deploying 15,000 troops to Colombia's frontier. At a September press conference, Maduro made his most defiant declaration: Republica in Armas, a republic in arms. If American forces invaded, Venezuela would mobilize millions of civilians for guerrilla warfare. The entire population would become the battlefield. The message from both sides was clear. Venezuela was preparing to fight for survival. Washington had assembled the tools to take it down in days. So how did we get from economic pressure to the brink of invasion so quickly? Let me walk you through the escalation timeline. January-March 2025. Devastating sanctions cut Venezuela's last export avenues. Total diplomatic isolation. April-June. The the Dragon Gas project canceled while Chinese and Russian support accelerated. July, the military terrorist designation crossed a line, criminalizing Venezuela's entire armed forces. August, the largest U.S. naval task force in decades gathered in Venezuelan waters. September, Maduro's war posture declaration made both sides publicly prepared for armed conflict. Each escalation now triggers a faster, sharper response. The window for diplomacy is shrinking. The risk of miscalculation is growing. One misread radar signal, one skirmish at sea, could tip this into open conflict. But here's the critical question nobody's answering. If this is really about drugs, why deploy 4,500 Marines with amphibious assault capabilities? Why not just intelligence sharing with Colombia? The deployment suggests objectives far beyond counter-narcotics. There are historical parallels. Panama, 1989, Iraq, 2003. Both officially targeted criminals or weapons, but achieved regime change. Looking at the evidence, the case for U.S. preparation is compelling. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, a destabilizing refugee crisis, and hostile foreign powers embedded. The Trump administration has systematically assembled everything needed: comprehensive sanctions, terrorist designations, overwhelming naval forces. This follows a well-known pattern: economic strangulation plus military positioning to topple an adversarial government without admitting its regime change. But the risks are enormous. Potential casualties in urban warfare, international condemnation without UN authorization, guerrilla resistance that could last years, possible confrontation with Russia or China, and uncertain benefits given how devastated Venezuela already is. So why now? Because Washington apparently views the costs of inaction as worse: ongoing mass migration affecting U.S. politics, accelerating Russian and Chinese penetration of the hemisphere, unchecked trafficking, and potential complete state collapse. So what happens next? The most likely scenario is continued standoff. Naval presence remains, economic pressure continues, neither side backs down, but neither acts. The danger is accidental escalation. There's a chance of internal collapse. Economic pressure triggers a military coup, allowing the U.S. to support a transition without invasion. That's probably Washington's preferred outcome. And there's the scenario everyone fears: direct military intervention, triggered by a terrorist attack, humanitarian catastrophe, naval clash, or weapon deployment that crosses a red line. The probability is still relatively low, but it's rising. Here's what makes this different. The tempo is faster than Cold War escalations. This isn't just US versus Venezuela. Russia, China, and Iran are directly involved. Any conflict could cascade into a genuine proxy war in the Western Hemisphere, something unprecedented in modern history. My verdict? Is the US preparing to invade Venezuela? The evidence says yes to preparation. The motive is clear: oil, power, and containment. The capability is overwhelming. The opportunity is present. The pattern matches historical interventions. Whether they actually will depends on unpredictable variables: a crisis, an incident, a political calculation. But when you deploy 4,500 Marines, criminalize an entire military, and position nuclear submarines offshore, you're not monitoring. You're preparing for war. Invasion has evolved from speculation to realistic contingency planning. We went from economic pressure to military brinkmanship in 5 years. The trajectory is unmistakable. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about how great powers compete in the 21st century and whether international law still matters. The question isn't, why would America invade Venezuela anymore? It's what could still stop it. And I'm not sure anyone has a good answer. If this helped you understand what's really happening, hit subscribe. Because if this escalates, you'll want to know before the mainstream media catches up. Drop a comment. Do you think the US will actually invade, or is this just posturing? I'm curious what you think. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next one.